wish that I could have shown you the video footage of anthropologist Sarah Brosnan's experiment with the capuchin monkeys, because words alone cannot do it justice. Copyright rules prevented that. If you Google capuchin monkey fairness experiment or capuchin monkey TED Talk, it'll come up, and we'll try and put a link on the Facebook page or the website. But what you see in this video are two female capuchin monkeys, and they're side by side in a plexiglass cage with a barrier between them. They can see each other. And the female scientist comes up to a monkey and she holds out her hand. And the monkey has been trained to take a little stone, reach through the cage, and put it in her hand. And over the course of years, these monkeys have been taught that if they exchange a little rock, they get a piece of food. And they do this now like 95% of the time. It's very natural behavior for them. And they like cucumbers okay, but as Jay read, they really like grapes. So the way the experiment works is the scientist asks for the stone, gives a cucumber. Goes over to the second monkey, asks for a stone, gives the cucumber. And back and forth. And as long as it continues like that, the monkeys are perfectly happy to trade stones for cucumbers 25 times in a row. No problem. So they repeat the experiment, and they ask for the stone, give the monkey the cucumber, she eats it happily, and then walks over, asks for the stone, and gives this monkey a grape. And the first monkey's been kind of wandering off in the cage, not paying any attention, but she kind of catches it out of the corner of her eye, and all of a sudden she's intensely interested. And she runs over and she plants her face against the plexiglass, and she's scrutinizing what is going on. So then she runs over and she grabs a stone, puts her hand out, and the scientist gives her a little bit of cucumber. She takes it, and she looks at it, and she reaches her arm through and she throws it at the scientist. And then she sees a bowl of grapes, and she starts kind of fumbling for the grapes, and she's pounding her fist, and she takes the cake and she starts shaking it. And the scientist just sort of coolly walks over, gives the other monkey a grape, and they repeat this process. And again, the first monkey, furious, gets the cucumber, what is this, throws it at her, totally refuses to participate. My wife Suzanne and I used to call that kind of behavior having a monkey moment. When our girls were little, and we would observe them, sort of sizing up the distribution of rewards at any occasion, right? If you have kids, you know how this goes. Soda poured into 3 glasses, and whoa, if any child received an unequal allotment, right? And how quickly a happy occasion could sour if it had been discovered to have been built on the rotted foundation of unfairness. J'accuse, our children would say. My sister's apportionment of ice cream is clearly larger than my own, and now my rocky road tastes like ashes. Now, there's an analogous test of the importance of fairness to human big people in a classic psychological experiment called the ultimatum game. And the way the ultimatum game works, it was invented by an Israeli mathematician who wanted to test the theory that in economics that we're all rational actors. So the way it works is you're given $20 in single dollar bills, and you have to split that money with another person. You don't know this person, you're never going to see this person again. You can give them any amount of money you want, $0 to $20. But the only trick is you have to propose this split to them. I've got $20, I'm going to give you 4 and keep 16. The other person gets to take your offer or leave it. If they refuse, nobody gets anything. Now, the way this is supposed to work, if everyone is a rational actor, the way that Rubinstein theorized this would work, is that the person making the deal should end up with almost all of the money. Because however much I offer to give you, that's more money than you had before. It's just found money to you. There's no rational reason why you would turn it down, even if I offer to give you $1. It's $1 you didn't have. So what they expect to see is people would figure this out, selfishly offer as little as possible, and the other person would take as little as possible. But that's not what actually happens when they run the experiment. What they found out is in reality, most people routinely reject anything less than about 30% of the money. There's no benefit to them in doing so. It's free money. But if you say, you know what, I'm going to give you 6 and keep 14, most people will say, forget you. And nobody gets anything. And sensing this, Most people actually usually offer to split the money pretty close to equal, without any prompting. Sarah Brosnan's work with capuchin monkeys suggests that some of this sense of fairness and unfairness may be innate, evolved behavior, right? It might be, so to speak, embedded in the core of our psyches, and it has evolutionary value if it encourages us to cooperate. We're cooperative animals. And in terms of social justice work, which is what we like to talk about here, that sense of fairness is, of course, enormously important and has motivated a lot of crusades seeking fairness, simple legal equality for all people. The idea that we treat one another equally and fairly is foundational to what we do here. But when the video clip of the capuchin monkeys went viral, and I got to reflecting on this idea of monkey moments, rather nothing, it reminded me of an interesting dynamic from the first years of the housing collapse, if everyone remembers the housing collapse, when all these people in America went underwater on their mortgages, which means you owe more on your house than your house is worth. And that's the title of the sermon, of Monkeys and Mortgages. This was Thomas Bramer's. So, when the housing bubble burst, literally millions of American homeowners went underwater on their mortgages overnight, and many of them went into default and foreclosure. In an NBC News report from 2011, 5 million homes lost to foreclosure at that time, and another 14 million underwater and headed for foreclosure. So this was a crisis, and it was and is not just a problem for the families themselves that are experiencing economic calamity. It affects all of us. Right? When homes go into foreclosure, when homes get abandoned, it lowers the property value of the neighborhoods that we all live in. It invites crime into communities. When people are underwater on their homes, they can't sell them. They can't move. Everyone's feet are sort of nailed to the floor, which means people can't pursue their dreams. They can't pursue better jobs. Economic activity slows down. It hurts everyone. And then just thinking of all those dislocated families, uprooted children, crushed dreams. Why would anyone want such a thing to continue unabated? It was a disaster. And yet, when the White House and other people started floating programs to rescue homeowners that were looking at default and looking at foreclosure, you would frequently hear a lot of our fellow citizens complaining about these offers of help and opposing them. And what you would hear is, I did the right thing. I bought a house that I could afford. I saved up my 20% down payment. I made a sensible decision. Where's my mortgage rescue? Why should all these people out here end up with a lower mortgage than me and a bigger house when they screwed up and I did everything right? Now, these days, with the food stamp program in the news and the subject of national debate, you hear the same kind of complaint, only now directed at the recipients of food stamps. And there's always a sort of mythical person everyone's heard about who's ahead of you in line, and they're piling like steak and lobster on the counter that they're going to pay for with their food stamps, right? Everyone knows that person. And you hear, why should these people on food stamps eat better than I do? I work hard to make ends meet. No one's helping me out. Where's my steak and my lobster? And so in a time of recession, with 49 million Americans living in food-insecure houses, the House of Representatives votes to cut $40 billion from the food stamp program over the next 10 years. So the positive side of that innate fairness that we feel is when it leads us to crusade for equal treatment for all. But the dark side of fairness is when it allows a legalistic conception of justice to eclipse our sense of compassion and to sever our sense of community with one another. Maybe you remember a presidential candidate recently who said 47% of Americans believe that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. I'll never convince them they should take personal responsibility for their lives. They believe the government should just give it to them. Now, those comments were not intended for public consumption, to put it mildly. But for the audience that he was talking to, The intent was to play on the dark side of their sense of fairness. I take responsibility for my life. Why should irresponsible people get a reward that I don't get? Tell me, how is that just? So there seems to be a sort of permanent undercurrent of anger directed against the poor people in America. And, well, I should say directed against the poor. Because it's not really directed against actual, real people who happen to be economically struggling. Plenty of us know people who are economically struggling, who might be economically struggling. This anger is directed at a mythical category of people called the poor, who are mostly conceived of as they're suffering from the consequences of their own bad choices. And these mythical poor people want to be rewarded for their bad behavior. They want something for nothing. And a certain kind of demagogue, who can be found all over the political spectrum, can play that sentiment like a fiddle if they want to. So that people's sense of fairness and justice causes them to react in an antagonistic way against the mythic poor. So that they say, no one is helping me out. Why should they, whoever they are, why should they get help? And then people's sense of justice, rather than being something that brings people together, becomes a tool for atomizing communities, for reducing people to isolated individuals who resent one another. Whatever your opinion of the Affordable Care Act, if you read comments by your fellow Indianians on it, for example in the Indy Star, it's pretty amazing the level of anger that exists that is directed against some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society. People that you would normally expect to elicit nothing but compassion, and instead they elicit anger, almost as though we're the victims of them. So the shadow side of justice is that it can rob people of compassion. One of the best-known stories describing this conflict is the one that we sort of told in the children's story today, right? The story of the prodigal son from the Gospel of Luke. In that story, there are two brothers. The younger brother demands his share of the inheritance, and he goes off to a foreign land, and he parties like it's 1999, and he loses everything, and he's reduced to being a servant, and he's feeding pigs, and he's eating the pig food because that's all he has, and it's miserable. And finally, he returns to his father, even though he's deeply ashamed because he thinks he's just going to starve to death. And he says, "Father, I have sinned against heaven, I have sinned before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." That's all he is asking for. Just treat me like one of your servants. And the father lifts his son up and embraces him and he kisses him. The Bible says he has compassion for him. That word, compassion. My son was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. And he tells the servants, everyone break out your party clothes. Go kill the fatted calf. We're going to have the biggest celebration this town has ever seen. And when the elder brother hears about this, like the little monkey's sister, he's angry. He's furious, actually, and he refuses to join them. And he's outside of the party. He says, "Father, I was here the whole time, doing the work, playing by the rules. I never left you. But you never threw me a party. There was no fatted calf for me." And the hard part of the story is he's right. Doesn't seem fair, does it? The father says, "Son, I love you. You're a good boy. Everything that I have belongs to you. But your brother, how can we not celebrate? Your brother is back." And he says, "Join us. Let go of your bitterness and join us." But the older son is trapped in his sense of the unfairness of it all. And he remains outside of the circle of community. Now, James Luther Adams, one of our great Unitarian ministers of the 20th century, he's writing about the parable of the prodigal son, which is normally conceived in terms of sort of God's love for all children, but he has a different take on it. And what he's interested in about the story is the perversion of what should be a moral impulse towards a destructive impulse. That's what he sees as the essence of the story. He says, "It has often been suggested that it should be named the parable of the elder son. The elder son who loses participation in community and cannot regain it, and his failure is due to the fact that he is a good man." Those are his favorite quotes, not my favorite quotes. "He does the evil as well as the good that good men do. He's right that he remains at home, and unlike the prodigal, he helps maintain the fabric of community. But when the prodigal returns, he becomes the defender of morality, the upholder of law and order, and he makes his ethical principles, his sense of justice, his sense of fairness, he makes it sacred and sovereign, but they turn out to be unreliable." Now, what James Luther Adams means by justice turns out to be unreliable is that the elder brother has made fairness his sovereign principle. Not a principle, but his highest principle. He's made it his personal God, so to speak. And he's put all of his trust in it. That if you just sort of mechanistically follow his sense of fairness, right and justice will be done. But James Luther Adams says fairness by itself is not worthy to be sovereign. In the mind of the teacher of the parable, he says, the sovereign good is not an ethical law, a mere law. The sovereign good is the power that transforms and fulfills the law. It's the creative element in the law that prevents justice from becoming self-righteousness and justice becoming injustice. He means when fairness or justice becomes its own end, when it becomes a good in and of itself, divorced from the love of humanity that it is intended to serve, then justice becomes self-righteousness. When justice is divorced from compassion, it becomes a tool for the self-protection of each against each, of me against you, rather than means by which the whole community is lifted up. Now this year, we're talking about our principles and relating them to virtues or concepts by which they can be lived or made visible in the world. And right now we're talking about our second principle, which calls us to seek justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And when I think of our second principle in its totality lived out in the world, justice and equity, but justice and equity tied to compassion, one word that comes to my mind is solidarity. Now that is actually a word that I hardly ever use, solidarity. And you don't hear it much in American discourse because it sounds kind of communistic, doesn't it, right? Like, I'm going to ask the Fine Arts Committee to start putting Che Guevara posters up on the wall in the sanctuary. But it means a society of equals who nonetheless recognize and embrace their profound interdependence. When we are in solidarity with one another, our sense of self-interest expands to include the self-interest of all. We don't cease to be individuals, but we see ourselves as individuals who are all playing on the same team, who are all in it together, so that what harms one harms all, and what lifts one lifts all. And so we seek to create a society in which we hold one another up, and in which no one gets left behind. The poet and activist Aurora Levins Morales says, "Solidarity is not a matter of altruism. Solidarity comes from the inability to tolerate the affront to our own integrity of passive or active collaboration in the oppression of others, and from the deep recognition of our most expansive self-interest, from the recognition that, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet, and that politically, spiritually, in our heart of hearts, we know anything else is unaffordable." So solidarity recognizes our interdependence. To begin with, just as a fact, we are not social atoms. There never was an isolated individual. There never was such a thing as a self-made person. As Dr. King said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And Unitarian Universalism being a reality-oriented religion, challenges us not to shy away from that fact, as we are not to shy away from any part of life. Unitarian Universalism challenges us to embrace it, embrace our interdependence, and then make something beautiful out of it. The reuniting of the separated is a recreation, said James Luther Adams, and thereby a new creation. As on the day of creation, when the morning stars sang together and all the children of God shouted in glory. Imagine the world we could create if we saw hunger and homelessness, illness and abuse, not as your problem or my problem, but as our problem. Imagine the creativity and vitality and energy and imagination and hope that could be unleashed if we could free one another from fear and want, from the moment-to-moment desperation that makes up so many people's lives. In solidarity, justice is not a weapon that pits neighbor against neighbor. It's not the means by which I watch you sink, so that I may more easily rise myself. Justice is the insistence that in the end, all people shall be free, all people shall be cared for, and all the children of God shall shout for glory. May it be so. Amen. Would you please rise in body or spirit for a closing hymn number 121, We'll Build a Way.